least contributed to.
All right,
euphoria,
good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch,
optimism,
broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, New
energy.
Mexico,
So I didn't
working on oil
I didn't
painting
feel the symptoms
A Midsummer
of what,
Night's
in retrospect,
Dream.
I would call depression, the lethargy.
Okay, yesterday I got the sky framed in a little bit and got her edges touched up to give her a little more definition.
So euphoria literally means...
What I think I'm going to do now is start playing with a couple of figures emerging from the background and also lay in the foreground grass coloration just to kind of block in masses of green and kind of scrub them into the texture, scrub it into the texture because I want to have, mushrooms and small details and different plants and, things like that in the foreground as well that are going to be rather small. And then in the background, I'm going to compose sort of the landscape, I believe, of these translucent, ghostish sort of forms. So I'm going to start with a donkey and a little horned, multi-eyed, multi-faced person that I suppose will represent the pan. And,
Given that a stimulant was your drug of choice.
so we'll start with that and see where it goes from there. Here we go.
Do you think, retrospect, you might have had ADHD as a kid?
Quite possibly. So,
Because typically people with ADHD self-medicate with stimulants.
yeah,
Because how do we treat ADHD now? We give people stimulants.
Yeah, Ritalin,
Real
methadone.
nothing. So a lot of people that choose stimulants as self-medication, like nicotine and caffeine and crystal meth and amphetamine, are actually self-medicating ADHD.
It's very likely.
Yeah.
And I was punished by teachers for, I wouldn't say not paying attention, but being interested in other things in class. So I remember very distinctly my kindergarten teacher, I'll name her by name because it's shameful, Ms. Bevan or Mrs. Bevan. I refused to learn the alphabet because she wouldn't give me a good reason why I needed to learn the alphabet. It was just, you need to learn the alphabet. So she made me eat soap in front of the class and put me at the bad table. She got me at the bad table, but I was always interested in doing many, many, many things. And in fact, one of the reasons that I started wrestling is because I was very hyperactive. And as I believe the story goes, other mothers recommended to my mom that she put me into something called kiddie wrestling to drain my batteries before I got home. So that makes perfect sense. I've never been drawn to depressants, never been drawn to opiates. In fact, after surgeries, I get very sick if I'm given Vicodin or anything like that, so I've opted out. I've never personally had any issues with alcohol, though a lot of people do. It's always been a draw to stimulants. And we don't have to go down this path because I want you to be able to focus on these definitions. But where I got myself into trouble was having never been physically addicted to any substance before. I started using the ECA stack once a day. My friend was using it twice a day. I started using it twice a day. Then I started using it 3 times a day. And you develop a tolerance very quickly.
Right. So you take more and more.
And if you stop, the withdrawal symptoms are
Absolutely.
awful. So
Absolutely.
I never experienced that. So I continued after sports to use this. And certainly in the long term, there are some very nasty side effects. But I didn't stop. For many, many years.
Well, so there's a great link between ADD and addictions, and not just because they both begin with the same 3 letters. And I can tell you about my own ADHD. And this is where we go back to childhood again. So that tuning out, that absent-mindedness, that desire to scatter your attention all over the place, that's not a disease. They say it's an inherited disease. The hell it is. That tuning out, that divided attention is actually... But let me give you a personal question again. If I were to become abusive towards you right now, verbally or otherwise, what would be your options right now?
I could ignore.
But that's not what you would do first, is it?
Not likely. Right now, I would probably just listen and pause. I shut down often if I get attacked verbally because I don't want to respond with rage, which has historically been my response.
I hear you, but let's get a bit more basic about it. The rational response, if I were to become abusive, would be for you to just assert yourself, saying, "Don't talk to me that way."
Right.
Or it would be to leave, saying, "This interview is over." And if for some reason you have not the strength to do either of those, there's other people in the room here with us, you could ask for help.
Right.
But what if you couldn't escape, fight back, or seek help? then you would shut down or tune out.
Right.
In other words, the tuning out is simply a defensive response on the part of the brain. Now put me back into my infancy, where my mother is so grief-stricken that I'm crying because she's in pain. And I'll read you a quote here, if I may.
Yes, please.
And this has to do with the sensitive child. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should, hence lack of optimism. Okay, now, my mother didn't abuse me. She did her best to look after me, but she was stressed, depressed, terrorized, grief-stricken. I'm picking that up as a sensitive infant. Can I fight back, change the situation, or escape?
No.
None of those. What can I do? Nothing I can do. My brain will tune out as a way of dealing with the stress. So I'm not talking about abuse here. I'm just talking about stress mothering or parenting. The child's brain then will tune out. When is the child's brain tuning out? When the brain is developing. So the tuning out then becomes programmed in as the default setting. And that's why ADD. So it's not an inherited disease. It's not a disease at all. It begins as a coping mechanism, which then gets programmed into the brain. And as a lot of these early coping mechanisms function, they help you in the short term create problems in the long term. And that's ADD is one of these examples. And of course, it also makes you more prone to be addicted, because now, when you tune out, life becomes less interesting, you shut down emotionally, you protect yourself, now you feel depressed. What does depression actually mean? You said you were depressed. What does depression mean? To depress something is to push it down. What do people push down in depression? They push down their emotions.
Yeah.
Why would they? Because the emotions are too painful. So even depression begins as a coping mechanism. You push it down so you don't feel the pain. But then later on, that interferes with your life functioning. So it all begins as a coping mechanism, and later on becomes a source of dysfunction. And all this is happening when the brain is actually developing, which we can talk about later. So these are the links I began to make, including after I was diagnosed with it. So and then despite the fact that a couple of my kids were diagnosed, I knew that this wasn't a genetic disease. That what it is actually is a coping mechanism which got programmed into the brain. And then when I read the literature on brain development, wow, turns out the human brain is shaped by the environment, and particularly by the adult-child relationships. And so it all began to make perfect sense to me.
So there are a few things I'd love to underscore or reiterate, because I think they're very astute and very helpful. And certainly, if I had had some of these reframes, I think that I would have been able to be proactive with working on a lot of my own issues much earlier.
Mm-hmm. Me too, by the way.
Yeah. For instance, we can come back to this. I'm actually just going to mention two things, and then we can go where that takes us. But the first is, rather than asking why the addiction, asking why the pain.
Exactly.
So instead of looking at the consequences, looking at the causes, and not confusing the symptoms with the causes. So instead of asking why the addiction, asking why the pain. And the other, this might take a moment for me to read, but I think it's worth reading. And I should say that Compassion for Addiction, this is an organization co-founded by yourself and Vicky. I'm going to make a guess. I've never actually said her last name, but Dulai. Vicky, just for context for folks who are wondering, was actually the very first person about 5 years ago to recommend that we meet. And I took a note of it in a notebook I still have. And that's part of the reason that I reached out for the book. And just because we may revisit this, I met Vicky at a gathering at the home of someone named George Sarlo,
Right.
who has a lot, who shares a lot of common background with you, and certainly common interests. But we'll come back to that. The part that I wanted to read is the following, and I'm going to make an attempt here. All right. So the mainstream view of addiction, you mentioned this, compared to the clinical perspectives that addiction is a matter of individual choice, moral failure, or weakness, which is why so many approaches are based on deterrence and punishment, which includes self-help approaches, for that matter, that I've attempted myself. The clinical view is that addiction is a disease of the brain with disordered brain circuits and behaviors, an accurate yet narrow perspective. So I think that's a really important line, an accurate yet narrow perspective. So perhaps accurate but incomplete. Right? It is accurate that the addicted brain is demonstrably physiologically dysfunctional brain, but narrow because it seeks to explain the dysfunction in strictly physiological and biochemical terms without recognizing the emotional and social component of how the brain works. And this was really driven home for me recently. In the last several years, I've gotten to know Tony Robbins.
Yes.
And I attended an event not too long ago with several of my very close friends called Date with Destiny. And at this event, he asked the audience of about 5,000 people, how many people here know someone who takes antidepressants? Pretty much every hand goes up. How many people here know someone who takes antidepressants yet is still depressed? And it's probably 80% of the people who raised their hands the first time. And I personally know quite a few people who take antidepressants, which seem to help on some level, although the tolerance for some of these pharmaceuticals can also be developed very quickly. And yet, if my experience is anything like the experience of, or I should say, if the experiences of other people is anything like my personal experience with friends, let's say, who have depression, you witness these thought patterns and verbal patterns that can take them from the highest high or just a baseline of optimism and drive them back into depression. And so it seems to be, just from an empirical or observational standpoint, more of the story. And so I really appreciate you putting into words what I've grasped to try to understand and also convey. So with this definition of addiction, how do you work with patients?
Well, let's go back to what I said, what you quoted me saying, not why the addiction, but why the pain. So if we understand that addiction in every case is rooted in some painful internal experience, and that when you ask people, what does the addiction do for you, they'll say, it numbs me, it soothes the pain, it makes me feel connected with other people, it gives me a sense of control, it gives me inner peace. Well, the lack of inner peace, the lack of control, the lack of connection, they're all forms of emotional pain. If I ask the question, not why the addiction, but why the pain, then that leads to an examination of that person's life, rather than looking just at their brain chemistry. So I'm quoted from an article that appeared in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's about as prestigious as you can get. 2012. The article comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, again a prestigious child development research institution at Harvard University. This article did not present new information so much as it elegantly summarized decades of research. And notice what they say. They say growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. That's what I was saying before. That was really adaptations, like pushing down your feelings when the feelings are too painful, will help you as an infant, as a young child, but then they cause problems later on. The tuning out that you do to protect you from the stress in your environment, if you're very sensitive, it doesn't take a lot of stress, helps you endure, but in the long term becomes a problem. That's exactly what they're saying. Now, I'll jump a few pages ahead to what they say about brain development. And this is so crucial, and it's so crucial because they still don't teach this in medical schools, even though scientifically it's not even vaguely controversial. The human brain develops in interaction with the environment. It's not genetically programmed purely. Here's what they say. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood,
Flares hitting
and
right where I'm
establishes
working.
either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Not some of the health learning, all the health learning. Now notice what they say. First of all, the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, which already means what happens in the womb already has an impact on you. So if your mother is stressed and she's got high levels of stress hormone, that's already affecting your brain development. And when you think of all the stressed pregnant women out there, no wonder we've seen so many kids in trouble. And we know from American studies, international studies, that when mothers are stressed, their placenta will naturally have more cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormone. Those kids will be more likely to have stress issues later on, abnormal stress hormone levels even at 1 year of age, behavior problems, learning problems, and so on. Which tells us a lot as to why adopted kids have so many more problems. That's another issue. But the next paragraph is key. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by, in other words, the circuitry, the chemistry of the brain, and which centers and which circuits and which systems develop, and which neurochemicals will be present in what quantities, depends on the early environment, and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the most important influence shaping the physiological development of the brain is the quality of parent-child relationships. Now, when parents are stressed or distracted or workaholics, like I was a young parent, if there's instability, economic troubles, relationship troubles, unresolved trauma on the part of the parent, loving parents who are just stressed, that'll interfere with the child's brain development. That's why we're seeing so much more ADHD now, so much more autism, and so much more other problems, because of stress in society that affects the parenting environment. In other words, yes, there's physiological problems with the brain, but it's not a genetic issue. It's related to early experience. So when you look at brain scans of adults that are troubled brain scans, as you do in addicts, you're not just looking at the impact of addiction, you're also looking at the impact of childhood trauma and childhood stress. And this has been shown over and over and over and over again. So there's no separation between the physiology and the psychology. So if you come to me as an addict and you say, I got such and such, and I ask you, what does it do for you? And you say it numbs the pain, then my question is, where did you develop the pain? What happened? And then we have an inquiry. And now it no longer becomes a shameful thing that you chose this, nor does it mean that you're stuck with it because you got this genetic problem. We get it as an adaptive response to something that happened, and we can heal that. The reason why addiction treatment is failing is because physicians don't understand this. They keep dealing with the effects, which is the addiction, and the behaviors, which are the effects of the addiction, but not the cause, which is the childhood distress. And the impact of childhood distress that carry into adulthood, in other words, how we stay prisoners of childhood. And so present methods of treatment in psychiatry, in addiction medicine, in childhood psychiatry deal with effects rather than causes. And this is why we're so ineffective at it.
I have many questions.
Yeah.
So the first is just to underscore something, which is our software, the genetics play a role, but it's not a comprehensive explanation for what we're discussing.
Well, genes can predispose, but they don't predetermine.
Right, exactly.
No, there are very few genetic diseases. There's one runs in my family, muscular dystrophy. If you got the gene, you'll have the disease. My mother had it.
Right, so that would be predetermined.
That's just predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
Very rare, those diseases. Let me tell you an interesting study from either Australia or New Zealand. They looked at a group of people for aggression. They found that the most aggressive people had a certain gene variant. Do you think they found the gene for aggression? No, they didn't, because the least aggressive people in the group had the same gene. So the most aggressive and the least aggressive shared the same gene as compared to the average. The gene could not have been for aggression. Now, if you actually looked at the life histories of those people, the most aggressive people had been brought up in troubled, sometimes abusive, but always very stressed homes. Mm-hmm. The least aggressive were brought up in very nurturing homes. What was the gene for? Sensitivity. The more sensitive you are, the more you're going to be affected. When you're brought up in a peaceful home, you're going to be that much more peaceful. You're brought up in a stormy home, you're going to be that much more aggressive. So there are these predispositions, but they're not for specific illnesses. They're for temperament,
Right.
which means that you're going to be more or less affected by the environment. And so, yeah, there are some predisposing genes, but we know both from animal studies, in monkey studies, and human studies, that even you find a gene that for similar reasons predisposes somebody to addiction, if that animal or if that human being is brought up in good, nurturing circumstances, their risk of addiction is no greater than creatures without that gene.
Right.
So it's just not a genetic disease. And the fact that it runs in families doesn't prove anything. Because, as I always point out, I'm a medical doctor, and if two of my kids become medical doctors, which is no danger whatsoever, but if they did, that wouldn't prove that the practice of medicine is a genetic disease.
Right. It's not a catch-all explanation. Also, you have, because of a few of the books I've written, I hear a lot of stories, both successful and unsuccessful, about people attempting to lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll often say, well, it runs in my family. Like, my parents are fat, my grandparents are fat. And I'll say, do you have pets? And they'll say, yes. I'll say, are your pets overweight? And they're like, yeah, my pets are fat. I'm like, okay, well, this is clearly not just a genetic issue.
Well, may I say something on that?
Yeah.
Well, have you heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies? The ACE studies?
The average child?
Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies.
I haven't, but I feel like there's a questionnaire or there's a test that you can take.
Yeah, there is. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies were done in California with, I think, 14 or 17,000 adults, mostly Caucasians, half of them university educated, and they looked at the relationship between childhood adversity and adult outcomes. And an adverse childhood experience was defined as physical or sexual or emotional abuse, a divorce, a parent being jailed, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a parent dying. These were the main ones. And for each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially, the risk of autoimmune disease goes up, the risk of depression goes up, the risk of ADHD goes up, the risk of relationship problems, STDs, everything goes up. Now, you know how these studies started? These studies started in an obesity clinic. Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's a San Diego internist, wonderful guy, deep thinker and researcher. They noticed that at this clinic, with rigorous dietary control and exercise, they could help people lose weight. But what do you think they couldn't do?
Couldn't ensure they continue those behaviors when they live.
Exactly, they couldn't help them keep it off. And then Felitti did something that's, I have to say, is unusual for a medical doctor. He listened to his patients. And they said, don't you get it? We're stuffing down our pain. This is all based on childhood trauma. And so obesity itself is a response to childhood trauma. It's just another addiction. I could talk about it in many ways, but and the adverse childhood experiences studies have been repeated numerous times now in other countries, always with the same results. And so that the obesity epidemic right now is not just an epidemic of junk foods and sedentary lifestyles. That is true.
Yeah, those are contributing factors,
but the underlying basis is people self-soothing the stresses in their lives. And so it's really an epidemic of stress.
So let me return to another point, or one thing you said in passing, which I'd love to dig into a little bit, and that was how at the time, say the example I think we were discussing, well actually before that, let me mention one thing. So I've had my full genome sequenced.
Mm-hmm.
A predisposition to alcoholism is very prevalent in my family from a genetic standpoint, just from a software basis. However, I mentioned earlier, I never had issues with alcohol with stimulants. So just as a footnote, but what I'd love to ask you, and then I'd really love to hear what you do with patients once you start looking at their pain and the tools you use or the approaches you use. But one of the epiphanies for me in the last very recent year or two has been looking at my coping mechanisms very differently. And what I mean by that is, for a very long time, I had certain behaviors, certain defaults that I hated, which of course means I'm hating a part of myself.
That's right.
And that included anger, rage responses, use of stimulants, you name it. A close friend of mine who is a therapist, but I've never engaged him as a therapist. And there are certainly plenty of bad therapists out there, which I think is a separate topic. Nonetheless, he was helping, and I'm sure we'll get back to this, but in preparation for a very controlled, supervised psychedelic experience, he was helping another friend of ours prepare.
This is with MDMA?
This is with ayahuasca.
With ayahuasca, okay.
And this person had a number of addictions. And she hated these addictions. And she said, I hate these. I realize they're terrible. They've ruined my life. They're ruining my life. And it was all a negative relationship to these behaviors. And he said, did these ever serve you? Did these ever help? What did these do for you?
Exactly.
And she described how they helped her cope with very difficult circumstances early on. And he said, perhaps what you should do as an exercise, and what we can do, is for you to effectively thank those behavior for the role they played and for the necessity they filled, and to then recognize, thank them for their duty effectively, but to let them go because they're no longer needed. And that was a huge eye-opener for me.
Okay, so
this is coinciding with a number of things.
I'm just going to chip at this one a little at a time. That's the beginning of the donkey and the pan, and sets up the groundwork. Color. So I'm going to leave that be for the moment and let it dry, and go tend to my movie, which just finished processing, which will be Cannabis Last Laugh, set to 230 condensed process movies, condensed again to fit the 5-minute and 17-second song, I believe. But it's going to be a fun one for any fans of the condensed TikTok medleys that I've been putting out. This is the latest and greatest. So that'll be posting in a little while, and then I'll post this up along with it or behind it. But that's it for the moment, I think. Yeah, I'm going to develop the shit out of this one. We're going to get very colorful and very weird with this, but I think that's a good toehold. So, call it good. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion today, working on oil painting A Midsummer Night's Dream. Have a good day, everybody.